Good day, everybody. It is Calxiyn here, and if you guys enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe for more RWBY videos. And this video was brought to you by my patrons and my YouTube membership members, so thanks to them for supporting the channel. Today we are going to be talking about the warrior in the woods from the RWBY fairy tale book. And this story, like, after I read it, I'm pretty sure this story is definitely true. Like, the most likely to have happened out of all the fairy tales. We know that silver-eyed warriors are real, and so I feel like that really helps. And so if that is the case, we have some very interesting silver-eyed warrior lore going on here, and so I hope that you guys are ready. Comment down below with your thoughts on this after I explain everything to you, and let's get into it. So the story starts telling us about a village that sits on the edge of a lush forest. The narrator notes that Grimm have not attacked this village for a long time, and the people thought that the woods protected them. Notably, as long as no one dared to enter the charmed forest, it would keep the monsters at bay. So let's look at the metaphor of this line specifically. Like, the village people here, they're, you know, complacent. At least I think so. Especially as the story unfolds, you see how complacent they are. They think that they'll always be safe and happy. And an important note about fairy tales, and forests specifically, we've talked a lot about forests and fairy tales, is that the woods basically operate as this sort of like transition space. Like, you're leaving one world and you're entering into another world. And oddly enough, this reminds me of Beauty and the Beast. So think of it like this. Like, everyone in Belle's town is complacent with their lives, right? Not really like wanting to change, not wanting to expand their minds or, you know, progress technologically or otherwise, all that stuff. Like, they think, oh, Belle wants to read? Like, outrageous. Like, they won't even like open their minds to that. They just live sort of, you know, very normal, like, little lives, I guess you could say, right? And so Belle knows, like, if she stays in town, she'll have a normal life, but if she leaves, there's sort of that chance that something better will arrive out of life, you know what I mean? Instead of it being this, like, cycle, because they're in a habit, they're in the routine in this town, they're not changing, they're not growing, and, like, Belle and her father, they're the ones who are changing, they're the ones that are sort of building things to improve lives and stuff like that. Like, they're clearly, like, just differently cut from the people in this town and all that stuff. They want to see, like, things change, you know? And so, like, throughout the fairy tale book, multiple times, it says that Grimm are what helped the humans evolve, helped the humans face challenges and stuff like that. And so without the Grimms to push humans, they stagnate, right? They don't push humans to be greater if they're not there. And so this is said multiple times. Now, it is said by the God of Darkness in another fairy tale, so maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a little biased by the God of Darkness, but he specifically says, like, he's so impressed by, like, humans' ingenuity. If he sends a tornado, they just rebuild stronger. If they get attacked by Grimm, they make their walls higher. Like, Grimm is what pushes humans to continue to evolve and continue to try. And so this town, right, is stagnating because they are living happy lives. They never have to change. They never have to try to be better because what they already have is fine, and that's gonna come to bite them in the ass later. So I really like the metaphor of that line specifically. I really, really like that. And so the kids, of course, start to play in the woods, and we've talked about this before, but the woods are seen as something forbidden, and that's why kids want to go in there even more. You know what I mean? It's sort of, oh, like, don't go into the woods, and we talked about why you shouldn't go into the woods. Like, back in those days, it was really just like, yeah, you could have died if you went into the woods. Like, it was more of, I guess it was a safety thing. Again, it was also seen as, oh, this magical forest, because I feel like that people's sort of, I don't know, realms of things were just sort of, like, very small, because they didn't have the same technology we have. You know, like, if I get lost in the woods, I have a GPS on my phone, I have a compass, whatever, right? All that sort of stuff. Like, I'm probably coming back home if I get lost in the woods, right? But, like, you know, people back then did not come back. People back then got attacked by bears. You know, if I go into the woods by my house, there are no bears. There are deer, maybe, but there are no bears. There's nothing, like, actually dangerous in there. But back then, like, there were dangerous stuff in the woods. So a lot of fairy tales are like, do not, please do not go into the woods. Like, that's basically what these fairy tales were sort of made to convey to kids too. Like, listen to your parents, all that sort of stuff. But this boy, you know, they're playing hide and seek or something. I don't remember what they're doing. And so he goes further into the forest, and instead of returning to a hot meal and a warm fire, he goes deeper. So again, like, this is the sort of fairy tale thing I mentioned before. The hero is giving up their normal life, their comfort, their safe life for something more, something else out out there. And I think that the warm meal and like the safe bed or whatever it said, like that is a very, very telling line of that he is giving everything up for the curiosity and the expansion and knowledge and all that sort of stuff. And so he encounters a Grimm. So not the smartest thing to do. Again, kids, do not go into the woods. There are Grimm in the woods, right? But he gets rescued. He's alive, don't worry. So yeah, Silver-Eyed Warrior rescues him, and we don't find out that she has silver eyes until the very end, but like, you know, I'm just gonna tell you guys, this isn't a spoiler, like, you know what I mean? This isn't a fairy tale, like me reading this story to you. This is us analyzing it, so I hope that you know, like, something, and if you don't, I'm just explaining it retroactively so you can see all the little bits of foreshadowing as well. But yeah, like, she basically, like, go home, you never saw me, kid. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even exist. And she basically is just like, yeah, I was never here, you know? And so she has a hooked blade, which is interesting because a lot of Silver-Eyed Warriors, like, excluding Crow, because Crow obviously, like, Crow has a scythe, but, like, Ruby has a scythe, and that's not connected to the Silver-Eyed thing. It's just a looking up to her uncle sort of thing. But it's interesting to note that Ruby and Maria, they both have very, like, scythe-like weapons, and I think that Crow, I can't remember if this is canon in the show or if this is just something a lot of people thought, but a lot of people thought that Crow, like, actually based his weapon off Maria, because Maria would have been this, like, legendary warrior when he was a kid and stuff like that. Is that true? I don't remember. That may just be a fan fiction idea. Anyway, so yeah, like, regardless, right? Like, Ruby and Maria, they both have hooked weapons. And I know that there are other characters with hooked weapons in the show, but when you see it, I don't remember exactly. It's like I think it's called a bill hook or something. It just looks like a scythe. Like, it looks like a smaller version of a scythe. It looks very much like Maria's weapons, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting that all the Silver-Eyed Warriors seem to have, like, that sort of, like, weapon preference. At least the ones that we've seen so far. All the Silver-Eyed Warriors and Crow, I guess. But again, if Crow was influenced by Maria or even by Summer, we don't know what weapon she has, right? Like, that would just sort of explain, you know, like, it's basically, like, it would still be inspired by a Silver-Eyed Warrior, even if Crow had it. Does that make sense? So yeah, something interesting about this particular story is that it uses a fairy tale convention that's not really found anywhere else in the book. Now, okay, we have to remember that the context in which our real-world fairy tales were created were very, very different. Like, there wasn't a concept of childhood back then, right? Like, childhood to teenager to, like, preteen and stuff like that. Like, those are very modern concepts. You know, you need to be preserved, like, from 0 until 18, and then after 18, you're an adult. It just wasn't like that back then, especially because, like, as soon as you're old enough to work in the fields, you're an adult. As soon as you stop needing direct care from your parents and they can, like, throw you, you know, to pick, like, corn or something, I don't know, like, pick fruit, like, or something like that, like, you're an adult, right? That was the idea back then, is that hitting puberty was basically, like, that sign that you stopped being a child, and so you were basically, like, an adult even if you were, like, 13 or 14, and, like, some kids go through puberty even younger, and so we have to consider that as well. So, like, basically what I'm saying is that we have to remember that there was no sort of, like, you were a kid, and as soon as you were, like, you know, off the breast milk and could carry, like, a pound of flour or something, like, you were good to go, all that sort of stuff. And so nothing ever happens, let's just be clear, nothing ever happens between the Silver-Eyed Warrior and the boy, but he is in love with her, he thinks that she's beautiful, and there's something like a romantic awakening going on here, right? It's more romantic compared to sexual, but it's something used in a lot of fairy tales, is that, you know, like, basically an adolescent that is transitioning, like, into an adult will have an encounter with something supernatural, and this, like, encounter is, you know, sexual or romantic in nature, and it basically transitions a child into an adult. It's a puberty metaphor, basically. And so, for example, right, Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, and then Jack and the Beanstalk and the Female Giant, which is interesting because both of these stories are in Into the Woods, and if you guys have never watched Into the Woods the musical, Into the Woods, make sure that this is, like, super clear. Like, the wolf is basically, if you listen to his song, like, he's a certified creep, right? And so Little Red Riding Hood specifically was a story that was used to warn girls, like adolescent girls, because the story, you know, lasted a long time. Eventually it got to the rich people, right? That's what we have to remember about fairy tales, is that eventually all fairy tales got to the rich people. And what did the rich people do? They basically took Little Red Riding Hood men and are like, see, young ladies, okay, you cannot fuck because men have silver tongues and men were the wolves all along. Like, that is literally, I can't remember who did it. I think it's Charles Perrault or something like that. I'll tell you guys if you guys ask. But yeah, and so like that is basically the idea, is that the wolf is the representation of a man who seduces Little Red Riding Hood with lies. And so the story is basically like, men are trash, do not give your, you know, your virginity up to the men. That is basically what Little Red Riding Hood got turned into at one point, to teach like young ladies of society that they should not be trusting or anything like that, right? And so the wolf, like there's literally a scene in Little Red Riding Hood and like these versions, like in even the older ones, where Little Red Riding Hood undresses and gets into bed with Grandma, and you think that that's a little weird, right? Like, why would she do that? But that's because she's undressing and getting into bed with the wolf. That is the point. So, now that we've explained that, and then in, you know, Jack and the Beanstalk, it's not really in all versions of Jack and the Beanstalk, but like there's a female giant. And in Into the Woods, it's sort of talked about, like, you know, the giant pulled Jack close into her breast, and now he knows things now that he never knew before. And so specifically in the musical, like, that is something that is, you know, refrained by these characters multiple times. Little Red Riding Hood has a whole song about it where she was eaten by the wolf, and now she knows things now. And so it's very, like, there's a lot of sexual things going on. Like, her experience with the wolf made her excited and scared, and, you know what I mean? This video is not getting monetized, but you guys know what I mean. She says, it's nice to know a lot, but a little bit not. So, like, she knows all these adult things now, but it's not great to know them, and all that sort of stuff. So that's something else that Little Red Riding Hood says. And so why am I explaining all this, right? Like I mentioned, metaphorically, these sort of things were used to represent children leaving their childhood and just transitioning into what was considered an adult at the time, right? The boy in the story is knowing things now, in a sense. He knows the truth about the woods. He has left his fantasy world behind, where the woods were, like, magical, and realizing that, like, someone is actually there protecting him. He is becoming an adult and, realizing the harsh realities of the world, basically, is what's happening here. So, like, metaphorically, like, it's basically a little bit of both. Like, you see him get older each time he visits the Silver-Eyed Warrior, because he is having these interactions with her, and he's basically like growing up. Like, every time he meets her, like, a shred of his childhood is basically taken away because he is finding out the truth about the woods. And again, that is very similar to like the Little Red Riding Hood and the Jack and the Beanstalk. Like, nothing sexual happens in this fairy tale, again, let me reiterate, but he has this like romantic like feelings for her basically up until the very end. And so it's sort of like his encounters with her is sort of like, you know, like removing the veil each time. And now he's an adult because he finally realizes this magical forest of his childhood is gone. He knows the truth about who she really is and why, like, she's been protecting them and all that sort of stuff. And so we'll get to that in a minute. But I just wanted to sort of explain that, because that is not something that is found in the fairy tale book any other time, which is sort of surprising and sort of not surprising. Like, RWBY is still a kid's show, right? But at the same time, there are a lot of fairy tales that do have those sexual elements in them, because fairy tales were not specifically for kids. Fairy tales were for adults back then as well. And so you have some fucking raunchy fairy tales, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, in this particular story, it's more of a romantic awakening and these encounters with the supernatural and all that sort of stuff. But I think it is basically a giant puberty metaphor, because each year he goes back, it's like, you know, he was a boy, now he comes back as a young man, then he comes back as a man. Like, that's basically the idea. And so then a year later, after the Silver-Eyed Warrior saves him and tells him to fuck off, he comes back with a dagger, and, you know, no, that's not killing the Grim, sweetie. I don't know what you thought was gonna happen, sis. And so she goes on to say, I remember everyone I saved and everyone I didn't. She paused to look at him. I see you didn't learn your lesson about coming into my woods. He held up the dagger. I came prepared. Her laugh was not unkind. So you're a slow learner. Don't come back, really. I came looking for you, he admitted. She narrowed her eyes. I don't train people to fight anymore. And so there are a couple of hard-hitting lines going on here. And so the first is, I remember everyone I saved and everyone I didn't, which means she's seen a lot of people die, right? That's definitely a hard-hitting line. I feel like the stuff with the dagger, again, it's another metaphor. Like, he's growing up, but he doesn't have all of the knowledge of an adult yet. He still has some of that naivete that, like, oh yeah, this dagger is gonna help. You know what I mean? And all that sort of stuff. It's like, each time, like, this is gonna be weird, but each time he comes back, he's growing more of a beard, in a sense, right? Like, the first time he has nothing, right? He's just, like, you know, baby-faced or whatever you call it. This time he has some stubble. He has the dagger. The next time he has, like, an actual, like, forged weapon, I think. And then the other time he has, like, 2 weapons, right? And so he's just, like, that's sort of the metaphor for growing up, is each time, like, the sword basically gets more and more complex, or he has one at all, right? And so, yeah, the other hard-hitting line is that she doesn't train people anymore. One wonders if it could be possible that Ruby's mother, like Summer, was trained by this silver-eyed warrior, or like any silver-eyed warrior, you know what I mean? Like, Maria was trained by her father, but who trained Summer? You know what I'm saying? Like, that would sort of be interesting if this silver-eyed warrior woman is who trained Summer to fight. I think that sounds kind of fun. Anyway, he delivers some clothes to her. She takes them, basically, and, like, you know, don't come back. That's what she says. She's like, okay, fine, I'll take them, but don't come back. And so what's actually interesting here is that, you know, he basically is like, oh, these are my mother's clothes, and, like, the silver-eyed warrior is like, is she dead? And he's like, oh, no, she's fine, she just doesn't wear them anymore, right? And so we also get, again, that sort of, like, I don't want to say, again, complacency, but it's sort of one of those things where it's like, the silver-eyed warrior expects the worst, because, yeah, people die in Remnant, and it's also that fairy tale thing that I talked about in a different fairy tale video of, like, the mother's always dying, like, that was a common thing in fairy tales. I'm not gonna re-explain it again, all that stuff. And so, you know, this silver-eyed warrior is like, okay, but is she dead though? And he's like, oh no, she's fine, she just grew out of her clothes. And so it's, again, the society is breaking the rules of Remnant, where so many people die. They are materialistic enough that they have, like, multiple, like, they have a bunch of clothes, you know what I mean? Because the economy is technically thriving, but they're also not advancing. So, you know, that's what that sort of reminded me of. It's like, oh yeah, like, my mom has tons of clothes, and she's alive because you've been protecting us, and we haven't been attacked by the Grimm and all that stuff. So at this point, we're at another year later, and the boy is now a young man. And so again, we're getting the puberty type of thing going on here. Like, after his 2 interactions with the woman, he finally is an adult who is ready to fight against the Grimm. He has a sword. He has a sword forged by the blacksmith, and the blacksmith is like, why the fuck would someone hunt with this? You know what I mean? And again, that's the reminder that all they hunt in that village are, like, animals for food and stuff. They don't advance to the point where they think that they need a sword and all that stuff. And so again, this is him forcing the town to advance, and he'll force the town to advance more later, but this is the first inkling of him forcing the town out of complacency, is like, I need a sword, and the blacksmith is like, a sword? Like, what the fuck? You know what I mean? And so I feel like that's pretty interesting. And so we see that he's progressively learning and growing up this time, and so he gets attacked. He's doing okay. He's doing okay. He did better. But, you know, he's struggling a little bit. He basically almost dies, and then a white light fills the woods, which we know are Silver Eyes. We know that. And so he's like, I knew you would save me, and she's just like, I told you I wouldn't. Like, why do you keep depending on me and all that sort of stuff? But whatever. She's actually pretty witty. Like, I would suggest you read this actual fairy tale. Like, she reminds me a lot of Maria, but again, we can assume it's not her just based on how the story sort of ends and all that stuff and the weapons that she has. But yeah, like, she's just a very witty character. I love all her dialogue. Like, you guys should read this for yourselves. So he says, then thanks for watching Over Me again. Not just today, but always. Thanks for protecting all of us all these years later without anyone knowing you're responsible for our safety. And so then he brings her some cookies, and, you know, she's like, ah, okay, I'll have some cookies. Like, I haven't had cookies for a long time. And then he comes back again. So at this point, like, he's come back, I think, 4 times, and then he comes back a 5th time, right? Like, most fairy tales operate under the rule of 3s, because 3 was easier to remember, because I have talked about this a little bit. Fairy tales were sort of an oral tradition, right? Like, you pass down fairy tales through talking, and so, you know, if there were 4 little pigs, that may be, like, too hard to remember, so there were 3 little pigs, right? And you see that in a lot of different fairy tales. Like, I think even Jack and the Beanstalk has, like, 3 different things that he goes up and get. I don't remember exactly, but that's sort of, like, the idea, is that these fairy tales were passed down orally, and so it was like, there are 3 little pigs, right? There are 3 of this, there are 3 of that, just to help people sort of remember. They operate under a rule of 3s. Remnant operates under a rule of 4, right? 4 kingdoms, 4 relics, all that stuff, but he goes back 5 times. So, yeah. And it's interesting because he also asked 5 questions. So, yeah, breaking some fairy tale conventions and stuff like that here. It's not really a big deal, though. So, he brings the bill hook for her. So, it's a new weapon. Like I already mentioned, if you look this up, this does look kind of like Maria's weapon. It is, like, again, a hooked thingy, and so it does remind me of a scythe and all that stuff. So he puts down his teacup. So now they're just having tea. At this point, like, she's accepted that he's gonna keep coming back, right? So he says, may I ask you a question? Go ahead and ask. I don't promise an answer. Nothing is promised in life, he said. You've grown up quite a good deal since I first met you. I had to. And so that's basically what he says. And so that's very, very interesting. I really like that interesting section of dialogue, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he says, my question is why? Why do you live in the woods alone? Why do you risk your life to save strangers? Why do you protect the village? And why this village? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So this is a really interesting, like, choice of dialogue, especially, like, that you've grown up a good deal. I had to. Again, showing us that he had no choice to grow up after what he had seen, which is, again, very common in fairy tales. She says, I live here alone because I am alone. And as a general rule, I don't like people. Most of my own people were killed long ago. My family, everyone I've ever known is dead. And if there are other survivors like me, they're scattered all over Remnant. Killed by Grimm? He asks. She scowled. Murdered by other humans. And so this is where we get more Silver-Eyed Warrior lore. And it may have been, you know, some time ago, Silver-Eyed Warriors were living in common, like, towns and all that stuff. They were living as a community, let's just say. Maybe some of them went out there to help others, but, like, they basically, you know, she had her own community of people, and then they were targeted and separated. An example could be Avatar, so I actually thought, like, oh, like, what about the air nomads? That seems a lot like this. In Avatar, all of the air nomads are basically killed except for Aang, and maybe there are possibly some other airbenders. Like, I don't think the first show goes into it, but I know, like, in Korra, like, I have this whole thing, like, oh man, Aang better be, like, spreading his seed or something so he can repopulate the airbenders, right? I've said that before, but I also think, like, if you guys have watched Avatar, no spoilers or whatever, but, like, by the end of the show, they sort of talk about, like, how people got the bending, and so I feel like that because Aang knows that, he could, like, it doesn't need to be, like, a biological passing down of airbending, like, maybe he would just be able to teach other people and, like, repopulate that way, but in RWBY, like, Silver Eyes are genetic, but yeah, that's what I thought of. I sort of thought about, like, the air nomads and how they were killed and all that stuff. Murdered by other humans definitely implies Salem, at least to me. Like, there's no reason for normal people to kill Silver-Eyed Warriors, especially if Silver-Eyed Warriors are fighting effectively against the Grimm. I feel like that this is probably part of Salem's multi-generational, like, you know, hunt, basically, spanning over hundreds or even thousands of years to wipe out and kill the Silver-Eyed Warriors. And so, yeah, it just doesn't make sense for normal people to drive out the Silver-Eyed Warriors when they're doing a good job at killing the Grimm. It only makes sense for Salem to kill them, really. Like, it doesn't make sense any other way. The village, back to the village, by the way, the village starts expanding up to the perimeter of the forest, and then they start to go into the forest to chop wood and build more houses. Some say they broke their promise with the woods, and others say there was too many people. And so again, this shows that the village is way too safe now. There is overpopulation. They are starting to build into the woods, and that starts to basically come back at them eventually. And obviously the key here is, like, Grimm, right? You know, the Grimm are coming back, and the woman is not there to protect them anymore. And so that is sort of what causes it, but at the same time, I feel like, again, this shows the complacency. Like, if you know, like, I don't know how to explain this. Nature has a way to deal with overpopulation. I guess that's what I'll say. Like, to keep everything in balance. And in a sense, like, the Grimm are that, right? Because if the Grimm weren't here, humanity would be built up too strong, if that makes sense. Like, they would spread out across Remnant, and it would be all, like, basically suburbia and all that stuff. That's what I'm imagining. Like, it would be all cities, and, like, nature would be destroyed, like, much like our world, you know, no tea, no shade, all that sort of stuff. And so, like, that is sort of the key, is that when the Grimm attack, yes, it's terrible, but also it helps humanity evolve, but also helps humanity to stop, like, you know, fucking around with nature, if you want to call it that, right? And so, yeah, and so that is basically what I just wanted to say on that. But the other thing is that the woman is not there anymore, and so Grimm attacks are becoming more and more frequent, right? And so, yeah, she's gone. So the boy goes back, or I guess the man now, he's a man, and her weapon was by the entrance, which is really strange. The door is missing, the interior was wrecked, and it had been abandoned for a while. So now, clearly, to me, this implies a kidnapping, right? Just because there's no blood, her weapon is outside. It's like somebody snatched her and like put her in a van and drove away, right? Like that's what I'm thinking, except no cars back then. But you guys know what I mean. Like someone just took her, right? She didn't even get a chance to fight back. Someone just stole her. And if there's no blood or anything like that, like I would say that I don't think that she died here, right? And I've had this theory for a long time that there was a point where silver-eyed warriors were killed, like Maria, right? Like Maria was going to be killed, not taken by Salem, but I feel like that there was a point where Salem realized something about the silver-eyed warriors and started kidnapping them instead of killing them. That's been my theory for a long time. That's why she wants Ruby alive. Maybe Summer is possibly alive. We'll talk about that later, but yeah, that's what I'm sort of thinking. Like, if he hasn't found a body and there's no sign of death, there's just sign of kidnapping, like, I would say that, like, she was kidnapped, and he also says if she was dead, right? If she was dead, she died alone, but there were no signs for sure that she was killed. And so that's what I'm sort of thinking, is that she was kidnapped by Salem, and Salem has been kidnapping the silver-eyed warriors for some purpose, and we're gonna find out what that purpose is, but it hasn't been revealed in the show yet. And back to the village. So he basically comes clean. He's like, listen, you guys have to know this, like, this is why the Grimm are attacking, like, there's no one to protect the village anymore because she's gone. And so he says, I wish I could have been there for her, he said slowly, the way she was there for us. If she was dead, she had died alone. Why did you keep going back there year after year? A village woman asked. Because she saved you? For that reason, and for many more, he said slowly. But I believe she knew the deepest reason of all. The group waited. He gazed into the fire. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her silver eyes. So that's where we get the confirmation of love. But again, I already explained like the supernatural romantic encounter thing and all that sort of stuff. Now, Ozpin says that the least believable element is that any child could live in Remnant without seeing a Grimm, and that part is probably embellished a little bit, but still, like, I feel like that some part of this definitely happened. Like, I just feel it, right? And he says that the story is used as a cautionary tale to prevent children from walking into the woods, and so that's a very standard fairy tale thing. We've talked about that before. Ozpin's message here is basically, like, to take social responsibility and stuff, you know? Like, if you can't help, it's your responsibility to help. Not everyone can fight, but you can help the people that are fighting. Like, that's basically the idea, right? Like, whether it's fighting or baking cookies, like, you're helping, right? And so Ozpin says that kindness can be as rare as silver eyes, and I think that's really cute. And so I feel like the moral of the story is, like, using our own abilities, doing whatever we can in our capacity to help, no matter what they are. Like, no matter what our abilities are, we can still help someone, even if we can't fight. And yeah, that's basically it from me, guys. I hope that we find more out about the Silver-Eyed Warriors in RWBY Volume 8 and all that stuff in the future. I have a strong vibe that Summer was kidnapped by Salem. I just feel it, like, I just know, and I feel like that this one probably was too. I feel like the kidnapping theory makes a lot of sense, right? She stopped killing the Silver-Eyed Warriors at one point, and she decided she wanted to, I don't know, study them or something. Like, I feel like that's realistic in a sense. And maybe that sort of happened, like, recently as well, like, when Watts sort of joined her, because Watts is a scientist. Like, he could do that, sis. At least I think so. I don't know. But yeah, that was a really fascinating read, and I hope that you guys enjoyed me analyzing it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys!